It's not gonna make me happy, is it?
Behind the charming suburban facade and workplace comedy genius lay a world of secret alcoholism, capri pants controversies, betting pools on Ottoman trips, and a production company name that was actually a hidden code. From Mary Tyler Moore's revolutionary wardrobe fights to viewers wagering on whether Rob would fall, this beloved sitcom harbored surprisingly bizarre secrets that would shock even its most devoted fans. Here are 15 weird facts you didn't know about the Dick Van Dyke Show. Fact 1. Ottoman gambling epidemic viewers.
I apologize. You're quite a guy.
Oh, honey, no, I'm not quite a guy.
Yes.
Of the Dick Van Dyke Show turned the opening credits into their own weekly betting game, placing wagers on whether Rob Petrie would trip over his living room ottoman or gracefully sidestep it. This bizarre gambling phenomenon emerged during the show's second season in 1962, when creator Carl Reiner decided to film multiple versions of the opening sequence and randomly alternate between them throughout the series' run. The show's original opening credits during the first season featured simple still photographs of the cast members, but sponsors pressured Reiner to create something more exciting and dynamic. Director John Rich, who was apparently in a hurry to get to a date, quickly suggested having Dick Van Dyke trip over a piece of furniture as he entered the Petrie living room. What started as a rushed creative decision soon became the most iconic opening sequence in television history. Reiner filmed 3 different versions back-to-back in just a few minutes. The first showed Rob stumbling spectacularly over the ottoman, the second had him expertly sidestepping around it, and the third featured him bumping into it but recovering without falling. Rather than choosing just one version, Reiner randomly rotated all 3 throughout the show's final 4 seasons, creating an element of unpredictability that captivated audiences. According to Dick Van Dyke himself, viewers became so invested in the Ottoman outcome that they would place bets before each episode aired, trying to guess which version would appear. Families and friends would gather around their television sets, making small wagers on whether Rob would take his famous tumble or manage to avoid it. The Ottoman became such a cultural phenomenon that decades later, the opening sequence has been parodied countless times, including in Family Guy, Tiny Toon Adventures, and even Disney's WandaVision series. Fact 2. The secret Calvada code.
I don't like to change barbers. You know, my guy knows my hair.
You ain't gonna know it for long.
The production company behind the Dick Van Dyke Show, called Calvada Productions, wasn't just a random business name, but actually served as a hidden acronym that spelled out the names of all 4 key partners involved in creating the series. The letters CA represented Carl Reiner, the show's creator and writer, while the L stood for Sheldon Leonard, the executive producer who helped bring the project to life after the original pilot failed to get picked up by the network. The VA portion of Calvada came from Dick Van Dyke himself, the star who stepped into the lead role after Carl Reiner was told by CBS that he couldn't play the main character in his own show. Finally, the DA represented Danny Thomas, the established television star whose production company provided crucial backing and whose recommendation helped Mary Tyler Moore land her breakthrough role as Laura Petrie. This clever naming scheme became something of an inside joke throughout the show's 5-year run from 1961 to 1966. The creators couldn't resist dropping references to their secret codename throughout various episodes, most notably when Sheldon Leonard himself guest-starred as a character named Big Max Calvada, a suspected mobster who wanted the writing team to create comedy material for his talentless nephew. The episode aired in November of 1963 and served as both a showcase for Leonard's acting abilities and a playful nod to the production company name. Eagle-eyed viewers could also spot the Calvada name scattered throughout other episodes in subtle ways, including a billboard that read, "Drink Calvada," in one particular scene. These Easter eggs represented the collaborative spirit behind one of television's most beloved sitcoms, where 4 entertainment industry professionals combined their talents and literally put their names together to create something that would endure for decades. The Calvada acronym perfectly captured how this groundbreaking show emerged from the combined efforts of its creators, producers, and star. Fact 3. Mary's butt controversy.
All I've got is a $20 bill, 7 cents, and a Linty-covered sour ball. None of which cab drivers will accept.
Procter & Gamble executives were so outraged by Mary Tyler Moore's form-fitting capri pants that they actually pulled their advertising from the Dick Van Dyke Show and nearly caused the series to be canceled after just one season. The controversy centered around what the conservative sponsors described as cupping under, which was their euphemistic way of referring to how Moore's capri pants showed the outline of her rear end too clearly for their comfort. In 1961, television housewives were expected to wear full-skirted dresses, aprons, and pearls while doing their household chores, following the example set by characters like June Cleaver on Leave It to Beaver and Donna Reed on The Donna Reed Show. Mary Tyler Moore had different ideas about what real women actually wore around their homes, insisting that her character Laura Petrie should dress in the comfortable capri pants and flats that actual housewives were wearing in their daily lives. The battle over Moore's wardrobe became so intense that Procter & Gamble representatives would regularly visit Carl Reiner's office to complain about the pants, demanding that Laura Petrie wear a dress in at least one scene of every episode. Moore later explained in interviews that the executives pointed specifically to the cupping under effect and said there was too much definition around her seat area for their conservative sensibilities. The controversy reached such a fever pitch that executive producer Sheldon Leonard had to fly to Cincinnati to personally plead with Procter & Gamble executives to continue their sponsorship. When that wasn't enough to fully satisfy them, Leonard had to scramble to find another sponsor, eventually convincing Kent Cigarettes to pay for half of the show's advertising time. This capri pants controversy inadvertently helped create one of the most progressive female characters on television, as Moore's Laura Petrie became a fashion trendsetter who influenced women across America to embrace more practical clothing choices. Fact 4. The false phone number.
Mr. Brady, can I sell you a letter opener? And he said, no thanks, I'm married to one.
Flub Dick Van Dyke made a classic acting mistake during the filming of a 1965 episode called Bupkis that was so genuine and charming that the producers decided to leave it in the final cut, complete with his embarrassed grin and the audible laughter from the crew members watching from behind the cameras. The scene required Rob Petrie to call a radio station after hearing a song with the unusual title, Bupkis. But Van Dyke accidentally performed the actions in the wrong order according to the script. Instead of looking up the radio station's phone number in the telephone directory first and then dialing it, Van Dyke dialed the number from memory and only afterward reached for the phone book to supposedly find the number he had already called. When he realized his mistake, he tried to cover for himself by saying, "right," after pretending to confirm the number in the directory. But his body language and facial expression clearly showed that he knew he had messed up the sequence. The moment became even more obvious because Van Dyke couldn't help but break into a sheepish grin as he attempted to recover from his error, while the sound of crew members chuckling could be heard faintly in the background. Rather than stopping the cameras and reshooting the scene, the director and producers recognized that Van Dyke's natural reaction was actually more endearing and realistic than a perfect take would have been. This behind-the-scenes mistake perfectly captured the spontaneous and genuine chemistry that made the Dick Van Dyke Show so beloved by audiences. The flub demonstrated how even professional actors sometimes mix up their blocking and dialogue, but it also showed how the show's collaborative atmosphere allowed for these authentic moments to become part of the final product. Van Dyke's ability to stay in character while clearly being amused by his own mistake added an extra layer of charm that viewers could sense even if they didn't know exactly what had gone wrong during filming. Fact 5. Last black and white show.
I'm not upset.
Well, you're gonna be when you see how fast they're going.
Ever the Dick Van Dyke Show holds the unique distinction of being the last television series in history to have its complete run filmed entirely in black and white ending its 5-season journey in June of 1966, just months before the television industry mandated that all primetime network shows be produced in color. This timing was purely coincidental, as creator Carl Reiner had actually considered transitioning the show to color filming as early as the 3rd season, but ultimately decided against it due to the significant cost increases that color production would have required. The show's black and white status became historically significant because the 1966 to 1967 television season marked the beginning of the mandatory color era, when all 3 major networks required their primetime programming to be filmed or taped in color to keep up with advancing television technology and viewer expectations. Had the Dick Van Dyke Show continued for a 6th season, as some had hoped, it would have been forced to make the expensive transition to color filming, which would have significantly increased the show's production budget. Carl Reiner made the decision to end the series after 5 seasons, partly because he had always envisioned it as a finite story with a clear beginning, middle, and end. But the timing also worked out perfectly from a production standpoint. The show wrapped up its final episode just as the television landscape was about to change forever, making it a perfect time capsule of the black and white era of television comedy. Ironically, decades later in 2016, CBS decided to colorize 2 episodes of The Dick Van Dyke Show using computer technology, bringing That's My Boy and Coast to Coast Big Mouth into the color era, more than 50 years after they were originally filmed. These colorized versions were released on DVD and Blu-ray, giving modern audiences a glimpse of what the series might have looked like if it had continued into the color television age. Fact 6. Rob's real nickname.
I'm jammed. It's locked.
Oh boy.
Slip Dick Van Dyke accidentally broke character during filming when he called Rose Marie by her real-life nickname, Ro, instead of her character name, Sally Rogers, revealing just how close the cast members had become behind the scenes throughout the show's 5-year production. This slip-up occurred during a scene where Rob Petrie was supposed to be addressing his colleague Sally about a work-related matter, but Van Dyke's comfort level with Rose Marie as a person caused him to use the informal nickname that everyone on set called her in real life. Rose Marie had earned the nickname Ro from her fellow cast and crew members as a shortened, more casual version of her stage name, and it became the way that Dick Van Dyke, Mary Tyler Moore, Maury Amsterdam, and the rest of the production team addressed her during rehearsals, between takes, and in their off-camera interactions. The nickname reflected the warm, familial atmosphere that Carl Reiner had cultivated on the set, where the actors genuinely enjoyed each other's company and developed lasting friendships that extended far beyond their professional obligations. When Van Dyke made the mistake during filming, he said something along the lines of, "Oh, Ro, I would never suspect you," instead of using Sally's name as the script required. The error was so natural and spontaneous that it demonstrated how the boundary between the actors' real personalities and their fictional characters had become somewhat blurred after years of working together in the close-knit environment of a television production. Rather than reshooting the scene to correct the mistake, the producers decided to leave Van Dyke's slip-up in the final cut because it added an authentic, unrehearsed quality that actually enhanced the believability of the workplace relationships between the characters. The moment serves as a charming reminder that even professional actors sometimes forget they're playing roles when they're working with people they genuinely care about and have developed real friendships with over time. Fact 7. Johnny Carson. Almost starred.
138!
What is it?
Mayonnaise!
Johnny Carson came incredibly close to landing the starring role of Rob Petrie on The Dick Van Dyke Show, with the casting decision ultimately coming down to just 2 finalists, Carson and Dick Van Dyke, but Van Dyke won the part specifically because he was less well known to television audiences and therefore more believable as an ordinary suburban husband and comedy writer. At the time of casting in 1961, Carson was already establishing himself as a popular daytime game show host and was building the television presence that would eventually make him a late-night legend, while Van Dyke was primarily known for his recent success in the Broadway musical Bye Bye Birdie. Producer Sheldon Leonard made the final casting decision after carefully considering how each actor's existing fame might affect audience perception of the character. Leonard worried that Carson's growing celebrity status would make it difficult for viewers to see him as Rob Petrie, the relatable everyman who balanced his job-writing comedy with his home life in suburban New Rochelle. Van Dyke's relative obscurity in television, combined with his proven comedic timing and physical comedy skills from his Broadway experience, made him the safer choice for a character who needed to feel like someone viewers could know in real life. The decision proved to be incredibly fortunate for Van Dyke's career, as the role of Rob Petrie launched him into television stardom and led directly to his casting in major Hollywood films like Mary Poppins just a few years later. Carson, of course, went on to become the undisputed king of late-night television when he took over The Tonight Show in 1962, just 1 year after The Dick Van Dyke Show premiered. Interestingly, Van Dyke had been under contract with CBS since 1955, which also gave him an advantage during the casting process, as the network already had a financial investment in developing his television career and was looking for the right project to showcase his talents. Fact 8. 3 different Ottoman openings. Carl Reiner actually filmed 3 completely different versions of the famous Ottoman opening sequence, and then randomly rotated between all 3 throughout the show's final 4 seasons, creating an element of suspense that kept viewers on their toes every single week. The most well-known version showed Rob Petrie spectacularly tripping over the Ottoman and tumbling to the floor in classic physical comedy style. But Reiner also shot a second version where Rob expertly sidesteps around the piece of furniture without any mishap at all. The third and least commonly seen version featured Rob attempting to sidestep the Ottoman like in the second version, but then bumping into a corner of it and stumbling slightly before recovering his balance without actually falling down. This middle ground approach gave viewers a compromise between the full pratfall and the completely successful navigation, adding yet another layer of unpredictability to the opening credits that aired before each episode. Director John Rich filmed all 3 variations back-to-back during the same shooting session, with Dick Van Dyke performing each version just minutes apart to ensure continuity in his appearance and the living room set. The entire process took only about 4 minutes to complete, according to Rich, who was eager to finish the shoot and get to a personal appointment he had scheduled for that evening. Reiner's decision to randomly alternate between the 3 openings was inspired by his desire to keep the show fresh and give audiences something to anticipate beyond just the episode content itself. The strategy worked so well that it became a talking point among fans, with families and friends often discussing which version they hoped to see before each episode began. This creative approach to opening credits was virtually unheard of in television at the time, making The Dick Van Dyke Show a pioneer in creating interactive elements that engaged viewers before the actual storylines even started. Fact 9. Alcoholism behind the scenes.
Vincenty wears a toupee?
He wears a rug.
Ear-to-ear carpeting.
Dick Van Dyke battled a serious drinking problem throughout the entire 5-year run of The Dick Van Dyke Show, consuming alcohol regularly to cope with his perfectionist tendencies and his compulsive need to avoid conflict with anyone involved in the production. But he managed to hide his struggles so well that most viewers and even some cast members never suspected the extent of his addiction. Van Dyke later revealed that he had been an alcoholic for 25 years, starting long before the show began in 1961 and continuing until he finally sought professional help in 1972, 6 years after the series ended. The actor explained in later interviews that instead of expressing any frustration with the show's demanding schedule, difficult storylines, or challenging fan interactions, He would turn to alcohol as a way to manage his stress and maintain his reputation as someone who was always pleasant and easy to work with. Van Dyke's drinking habit was so well concealed that he continued to deliver flawless comedic performances and maintain the physical coordination necessary for his signature pratfalls and dance sequences, even while struggling with his addiction behind the scenes. Meanwhile, Mary Tyler Moore was dealing with her own serious health crisis that went undiagnosed for years, experiencing symptoms of what would later be identified as type 1 diabetes. Moore suffered from frequent bouts of blurred vision, unexplained dizziness, and sudden weight loss during the show's production, but medical professionals at the time failed to recognize these warning signs as indicators of the serious autoimmune condition that was affecting her blood sugar levels. Moore's diabetes wasn't properly diagnosed until 1969, 3 years after the Dick Van Dyke Show ended, when a routine blood test revealed that her blood sugar levels were dangerously high at 750 compared to the normal range of 70 to 110. Both stars demonstrated remarkable professionalism by delivering consistently excellent performances while privately battling these significant health challenges. Fact 10. The hidden theme song lyrics. Maury Amsterdam, who played the wisecracking comedy writer Buddy Sorrell on the show, secretly composed a complete set of lyrics for the Dick Van Dyke Show's famous instrumental theme song. But the producers ultimately decided to keep the opening music purely instrumental, rather than turning it into a sung introduction like many other sitcoms of the era. Amsterdam's lyrics were cleverly crafted to match the upbeat, optimistic tone of Earl Hagen's memorable melody, and they began with the cheerful philosophical observation about not letting problems get you down. The complete lyrics that Amsterdam wrote started with the opening lines about troubles being like bubbles that eventually pop and disappear, encouraging listeners to tell their problems, to get lost and maintain a positive attitude instead of dwelling on difficulties. The song continued with advice about holding your head up high, stopping crying and starting trying, and always keeping your fingers crossed for good luck and better times ahead. Amsterdam's unused lyrics also included references to finding joy through loving and giving to others, being present when good fortune comes your way, and remembering that a smile is simply an upside-down frown that can be turned around with the right attitude. The lyrics concluded with a reminder to keep your fingers crossed and maintain hope even during challenging times, which perfectly captured the show's underlying message about finding happiness through family, friendship, and laughter. Dick Van Dyke kept Amsterdam's secret lyrics private for decades until he finally revealed them during a 2010 interview, surprising fans who had never imagined that the familiar instrumental opening they had heard hundreds of times actually had words that could be sung along with it. The lyrics demonstrated Amsterdam's talent as both a performer and a writer, showing how he understood the show's core themes about optimism, relationships, and finding humor in everyday situations that made Rob and Laura Petrie's world so appealing to audiences. Fact 11. Rose Marie versus Mary Tyler Moore. Rose Marie was the first actor cast on the Dick Van Dyke Show and was initially told that the series would primarily focus on the comedy writer's room dynamics, making her character Sally Rogers one of the central figures in what was originally conceived as a workplace sitcom about television writing. But as the show evolved during its 5-year run, the balance gradually shifted toward Rob and Laura's home life, creating an unexpected source of tension between Rose Marie and the newcomer Mary Tyler Moore. Rose Marie had extensive show business experience as a former child star and established television performer, having appeared regularly on programs like The Bob Cummings Show, and she naturally expected to maintain her prominent role as one of the show's featured players. Mary Tyler Moore, who was just 24 years old when she joined the cast, was relatively unknown in television and was initially hired to play what seemed like a supporting role as Rob's wife Laura, but the writers quickly discovered that Moore had exceptional comedic timing and screen presence that made her scenes particularly engaging for audiences. As Carl Reiner and the writing staff began crafting more storylines around the Petrie family's suburban adventures, Rosemarie found herself with fewer featured moments and less screen time than she had originally been promised. Rosemarie later admitted in interviews that she felt some jealousy toward Moore because the younger actress was receiving more attention from both the writers and the viewing public, and she acknowledged that this professional rivalry prevented the two women from developing a close personal friendship during the show's production. Rosemarie's daughter explained that her mother spent most of her time socializing with the male cast members like Dick Van Dyke and Maury Amsterdam, while Moore remained somewhat separate from the group dynamic. The conflict was never openly hostile, but it represented the kind of behind-the-scenes tension that can develop when a show's original concept evolves in ways that change the relative importance of different characters and performers. Fact 12. The famous Baby Switch episode.
Daddy fight a lot better than you and Mommy.
Rich,
The episode titled "That's My Boy" created one of the most memorable moments in television history when the live studio audience laughed so hard and for so long that the cameras had to stop rolling completely until the crowd could calm down enough for filming to continue. The storyline involved Rob and Laura Petrie becoming convinced that the hospital had accidentally switched their newborn baby Richie with another family's child because of confusion between the similar-sounding names Petrie and Peters during Laura's stay at the maternity ward. Rob becomes increasingly paranoid about the mix-up and decides to invite the Peters family over to their house so both couples can compare their babies and make the switch if necessary. But neither Rob nor Laura has actually seen the other family before this meeting. When Rob opens the front door to greet their visitors, he discovers that the Peters family is African American, which immediately makes it obvious to everyone involved that no baby switch could have possibly occurred given the clear physical differences between the families. The moment was groundbreaking for 1963 television because it addressed racial topics in a way that was both comedically brilliant and socially progressive at a time when the civil rights movement was gaining momentum and interracial interactions were rarely portrayed on mainstream television shows. Carl Reiner had to fight with CBS network executives to get permission to film the episode, with some officials worried that the racial content might be too controversial for audiences in certain parts of the country. When the big reveal happened during the live taping, the studio audience erupted into such sustained laughter, cheering, and applause that it became impossible for the actors to continue with their lines, forcing the production crew to halt filming until the crowd's reaction subsided. Dick Van Dyke later described it as the longest laugh he had ever experienced in his entire show business career, and the episode became his personal favorite from the series' entire run. Fact 13. Twin Bed's hypocrisy.
I've been sitting here wanting lettuce and tomatoes, and now I know why. It's that smell.
CBS network censors strictly enforced a policy that required Rob and Laura Petrie to sleep in separate twin beds throughout the Dick Van Dyke Show's entire 5-year run from 1961 to 1966. But just a few years later, the same network allowed Bob Newhart and Suzanne Plachette to share a double bed as a married couple on The Bob Newhart Show, creating a frustrating double standard that still bothers Dick Van Dyke to this day. Carl Reiner had specifically requested permission from CBS executives to show the Petries sleeping together in one bed, reasoning quite sensibly that he and his wife shared a bed in real life, and most married couples across America did the same thing. The network's rejection of this reasonable request reflected the conservative television standards of the early 1960s, when most sitcom couples were depicted sleeping in twin beds to avoid any suggestion of sexual intimacy between married characters, even though everyone understood that these couples obviously had physical relationships since they had children together. The absurd nature of this censorship rule became even more apparent when viewers saw Rob and Laura discussing intimate topics while sitting on their separate beds, creating an artificial barrier that made their marriage seem less realistic and authentic. Dick Van Dyke has remained vocal about his frustration with this policy in interviews decades later, pointing out that The Bob Newhart Show premiered in 1972 and immediately featured the married main characters sharing a bed without any controversy or complaints from viewers. Van Dyke has jokingly said that he's still mad about the inconsistency, especially since both shows aired on CBS and featured similar suburban married couples dealing with work and family life. The twin bed requirement was part of broader television censorship standards that also prevented the show from using the word pregnant on the air, forcing the writers to find creative euphemisms whenever Laura's pregnancy needed to be discussed in storylines or dialogue. Fact 14. Mary's age lie. Inspiration.
Hey, just like what happened with you and Daddy.
Mary Tyler Moore reportedly told the producers she was older than her actual age in order to land the role of Laura Petrie, a deception that the show's writers later turned into one of their most memorable storylines when they created an episode where Laura confesses to lying about her age to Rob during their courtship. Moore was born in December of 1936, which would have made her only 24 years old when the Dick Van Dyke Show premiered in October of 1961. But she apparently convinced the casting directors that she was more mature and experienced than her real age suggested. The age discrepancy became particularly noticeable because Dick Van Dyke was 11 years older than Moore, and the producers were initially concerned that the significant age gap between the two actors might make their on-screen marriage seem unrealistic or uncomfortable to viewers. Moore's decision to present herself as older helped bridge that gap and made the casting seem more appropriate for a show about a settled suburban couple with an established marriage and a young child. Carl Reiner and the writing team eventually discovered Moore's real age and decided to incorporate this real-life situation into the show's fictional storyline, creating the episode Laura's Little Lie in 1963. In this episode, Laura becomes nervous about a doctor's visit required for a new insurance policy because she's worried the medical examination will reveal that she's actually younger than the age she told Rob when they first met, when she claimed to be 19 but was actually only 17 years old. The storyline was so popular that it led to a follow-up episode called Very Old Shoes, Very Old Rice, where Rob and Laura have to get remarried because Laura's age deception technically invalidated their original marriage ceremony. These episodes demonstrated how the show's writers skillfully transformed real behind-the-scenes situations into compelling television content that resonated with audiences who could relate to the small lies people sometimes tell in relationships. Fact 15. The Ottoman inspiration source.
He's not my keeper.
Oh, where is your keeper? Still at the zoo?
The famous Ottoman tripping gag that became the Dick Van Dyke Show's most iconic visual element was directly inspired by a scene from Charlie Chaplin's 1936 film Modern Times, where the beloved tramp character daydreams about domestic life and imagines himself coming home to a cozy living room only to trip over a piece of furniture in a moment of physical comedy perfection. This connection to Chaplin's work was particularly meaningful because Dick Van Dyke had been a lifelong admirer of silent film comedians and credited them with inspiring his decision to become a performer in the first place. Van Dyke often spoke in interviews about how the silent era masters like Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, and especially Stan Laurel of Laurel and Hardy had taught him everything he knew about physical comedy and pratfalls. He studied their techniques carefully and developed his own drop-and-roll method that allowed him to take spectacular tumbles without getting injured, a skill that served him well throughout his career on stage, television, and in movies. The specific Ottoman gag represented a perfect tribute to Chaplin's influence, while also creating something entirely new for television audiences who had never seen this kind of sophisticated physical comedy integrated into a sitcom's opening credits. Van Dyke's execution of the fall was so expertly choreographed and performed that it looked both completely accidental and utterly graceful at the same time, capturing the same balance between clumsiness and artistry that had made Chaplin's tramp character so endearing to audiences around the world. The homage to modern times also reflected the show's overall approach to comedy, which combined workplace humor with domestic situations in a way that echoed the themes Chaplin had explored about modern life, relationships, and the challenges of balancing personal happiness with professional responsibilities in an increasingly complex world.